A piece of paper survives from a courthouse in South Carolina. It was written in 1850, and on it, tucked between a list of spinning wheels, farm tools, and cattle, is a 6-year-old girl. She is not named as a daughter or a niece. She's named as property. Her price is written next to her, $475. More than a century and a half later, a direct descendant of that little girl would walk into the White House as the first black first lady in American history. And for almost her entire life, she would have no idea any of this existed. This is not a story that Michelle Obama grew up knowing. It was not passed down at family dinners. It was dug up piece by piece by reporters and a genealogist, and later confirmed by something no document could argue with. DNA pulled from cheek swabs of strangers who did not yet know they were family. Most people who have heard some version of the story know the short version. Enslaved girl, 5 generations, White House. It sounds tidy. It sounds like a straight line from suffering to triumph. But the real story has a hole in the middle of it, a person whose name was erased on purpose and stayed erased for over 100 years. And the reason he was erased tells you almost everything about how this country handled its own history. Let's start with the girl herself, because everything else in this story only makes sense once you understand what happened to her. Her name was Melvinia. She was born around 1844, most likely enslaved on a South Carolina farm belonging to a man named David Patterson. She grew up around roughly 20 other enslaved people. That number matters, so hold on to it. 20 people means a girl like Melvinia would have grown up with something close to a community, other children, older women who looked out for her, adults who had known her since she was born. It was a brutal life by any measure, but it was not a life lived alone. Then Patterson died. And like most estates in that era, his property, all of it, human and otherwise, was divided among his heirs. Somewhere in the paperwork, a clerk or the estate itself listed Melvinia's value at $475. She appears in the document simply as Negro Girl Melvinia, sitting on the page next to tablecloths and scythes. She was around 6 years old. She had no say in any of it, obviously, because 6-year-olds owned as property don't get a say in anything. Melvinia was given, or gifted, as some records phrase it with a chilling politeness, to Patterson's daughter and her husband, a man named Henry Wells Shields. That meant leaving South Carolina behind. Somewhere between the ages of 6 and 8, Melvinia was taken from every person she had ever known and shipped to a farm in Georgia, in what is now the town of Rex, in Clayton County. And here is the detail that changes the entire shape of this story. Henry Shields was not a wealthy plantation owner with dozens or hundreds of enslaved people. He ran a modest farm, roughly 200 acres, growing wheat, cotton, and corn. He owned exactly 3 enslaved people. 3. In a region where most of his neighbors owned none at all. Think about what that actually meant for a child. Melvinia went from a group of 20 people, a rough kind of community, to a household of 3. On a large plantation, an enslaved child at least has other enslaved adults around her, people to talk to, people who might notice if something was wrong, some small margin of collective memory and protection. On a farm with 3 enslaved people total, in a county where most families had none, there was no crowd to disappear into and no one nearby who understood her situation. There was the family that owned her, the 2 other people enslaved alongside her in silence. Melvinia never learned to read or write. This wasn't unusual. It was, in fact, the law. Teaching enslaved people literacy was illegal across most of the South by that point, precisely because literacy gives people a way to record their own lives, on their own terms, outside of what their owners chose to say about them. Melvinia left no diary, no letter, no written account of what her days actually looked like. Everything we know about her early years in Georgia comes from other people's paperwork, and other people's paperwork is never neutral. In 1859, Melvinia gave birth to a son. She was around 15 years old. His name was Dolphus, and his father was a white man. Sit with that for a second before moving on, because it's tempting to rush past this part, and rushing past it is exactly how this kind of history gets softened into something more comfortable than it actually was. A 15-year-old girl, legally owned by another family, unable to read, unable to write, living on an isolated farm with no legal standing to refuse anything asked of her, gives birth to a child fathered by a white man whose identity would not be written down anywhere for a century and a half. When census takers came around in 1870, they wrote one word next to Dolphus's name to describe his background: mulatto. One word, doing the job that an entire missing biography should have done. No name for the father, no explanation, just a racial classification standing in for a real answer, because writing down an actual name would have meant admitting to something. And Melvinia never said the name either, not once, as far as any record shows. She lived until 1938, reaching 94 years old. She lived long enough to see cars, airplanes, and a world completely unrecognizable from the one she was born into. Family members reportedly asked her, more than once, who Dolphus's father was. She never told them. Whatever her reasons were, and there could have been many, fear, self-protection, protecting her children from more scrutiny, or something far more complicated that doesn't reduce easily into a single motive, she made a decision early on, and she kept it for the rest of her life. It may have been one of the only things in her entire existence that was completely and only hers to control, and she controlled it completely. That silence held for generations. It held through the Civil War, through Reconstruction, through the entire 20th century. It held right up until 2008, when a woman named Michelle Robinson Obama became a serious candidate for First Lady of the United States, and campaigns, being campaigns, decided to look into her family background. Here's what almost nobody realized at the time. Michelle Obama genuinely did not know any of this. She has spoken publicly about how she grew up with only a rough sense of her family's past. She spent childhood summers visiting relatives in South Carolina, physically close to the very land where some of her ancestors had been enslaved, and it simply was not something the family talked about. That's not unusual. It's actually the norm. Painful history inside families tends to get buried, not because people don't care, but because remembering it costs something. And a lot of families quietly decide not to pay that cost generation after generation. Once Barack Obama's campaign began digging into genealogy, researchers eventually turned their attention to Michelle's side of the family too. A professional genealogist named Megan Smoleniak, the same researcher who had previously traced Barack Obama's Irish ancestry back to a village called Moneygall, started working on Michelle's maternal line. And that's when she found the will, the estate document, the 6-year-old girl, the $475. Smoleniak has said the discovery stayed with her afterward, that the girl in that document was hard to shake. In October of 2009, the New York Times ran the story on its front page. Reporters Rachel Swarns and Jodi Kantor had traced Michelle Obama's ancestry back 5 generations, connecting the sitting First Lady directly, by name, to American slavery. At the time, it felt like the end of an investigation. It was actually only the beginning, because there was still a gap in the middle of the story that paper records alone could never fill. Nobody knew who Dolphus's father was. This is where you have to understand something about African American genealogy specifically, because it explains why this case was so unusual. For most American families, tracing ancestry is slow but doable. You follow census records, marriage licenses, church registries, and land deeds backward in time, one document at a time. But for black families, that trail typically hits a wall around 1870. Before that year, enslaved people were generally not recorded by name in the federal census. They show up as tally marks, a number, an age, a sex, a skin tone category, no name. Because writing a name down would have meant acknowledging a person, and the entire economic and legal machinery of slavery depended on not acknowledging that. So for millions of black American families today, the paper trail doesn't just get difficult before 1870, it stops completely. That wall is exactly what was blocking the identity of Dolphus's father. So the investigation, led by Swarns for a follow-up piece published in 2012, tried something different. Instead of relying only on paper, they turned to DNA. The logic behind it was fairly simple once you think it through. If Dolphus's father really was connected to the Shields family that had owned Melvinia, which was the working theory given that she lived in a household with only 3 enslaved people total, then his genetic material didn't disappear when he died. It would have passed down through any other children he had, the ones who were free, whose births were recorded, whose family lines were never hidden. Those descendants were still alive, living ordinary lives across the American South, unknowingly carrying inside them the answer to a question a 15-year-old girl had refused to answer more than a century earlier. But getting that DNA meant asking white families in Georgia and South Carolina to voluntarily take a test that could confirm their ancestors had owned, and quite possibly assaulted, the ancestor of the sitting First Lady of the United States. That is an extraordinarily difficult phone call to make, and an even harder one to receive. Some families declined. Others agreed and were genuinely shaken by what it might mean. One descendant later said she was stunned to learn her own family had owned enslaved people at all. She simply hadn't known. That's a detail people tend to skip over. The forgetting in this story wasn't only on one side. White descendants of the Shields family often had no idea about any of this either. 2 branches of the same bloodline had been living in the same country for generations, completely unaware the other existed. A woman named Joan Tribble, a descendant of the Shields family that had once owned Melvinia, agreed to be tested. Descendants on Melvinia and Dolphus's side agreed as well. The results confirmed a genetic connection between the 2 families. Combined with the historical research, the evidence pointed to one specific man, Charles Marion Shields, the son of Henry Wells Shields, the same Henry Shields who had once owned Melvinia. Charles would have grown up in that same small household. He and Melvinia may well have known each other since childhood, on a farm with only 3 enslaved people and 1 white family living in close proximity every single day. We should be careful here, because the honest version of this story is genuinely more difficult than a clean, dramatic one. Nobody alive today can say exactly what happened between Melvinia and Charles Shields, and nobody ever will, because the one person who could explain it chose, deliberately and for the rest of her life, not to. What can be said with confidence is this: in a household where one person is legally owned by the family of another, the very idea of consent doesn't function the way it does between free people. A 15-year-old enslaved girl in Georgia in 1859 had no legal mechanism to refuse a white man in that household anything. The sexual exploitation of enslaved women by the men who owned or lived alongside them was disturbingly common in that era. Historians don't treat it as some rare scandal. It was a routine, largely unpunished feature of how slavery actually operated day to day. And then the story complicates itself further in a way that resists any tidy conclusion. By the 1870 census, slavery was over. Melvinia was legally free, and yet records show her still living near Charles Shields and his wife. 3 of her 4 children were recorded as mixed race, and one of them was born after emancipation, after she was legally free to leave. What do you do with that fact? It doesn't prove some kind of consensual relationship, because a formerly enslaved black woman in rural Georgia in the years right after the war had almost none of the practical freedom that legal freedom was supposed to guarantee. No land, no money. No institution that would side with her over a white man if things went wrong. But it also isn't simply the story of a woman who fled the moment she could. It's something far messier and less resolvable than either of those neat narratives, and the honest answer is that we cannot know which one is closer to the truth. When some of Charles Shields' white descendants eventually learned about this history, they said they hoped it had been some form of love. That's an understandable thing to hope. It costs nothing to hope, and it makes a painful history easier to sit with. But hope isn't evidence, and Melvinia is not here to confirm or deny it. Eventually, Melvinia moved again, this time to Kingston, Georgia, apparently trying to reconnect with people from the South Carolina community she had been separated from as a child. And there, she became a midwife. For decades, a woman whose own body had been used against her before she was even old enough to legally consent to anything spent the rest of her working life helping other people safely bring children into the world. She was known locally as Aunt Matilda, or similar names in community memory, and she was a member of a local church congregation. Decades later, when a memorial ceremony was eventually held in her honor, an elderly man attended specifically because Melvinia had personally delivered him as a baby. That's how close this history actually is. It isn't some distant, fated past. A living person in recent memory had a direct personal connection to a woman who had once been valued at $475 on an estate list. Melvinia died on June 4th, 1938, at 94 years old. She was buried behind her church, and over time, the exact location of her grave was lost. Researchers eventually had to use ground-penetrating radar just to find her remains. Sit with that for a second. Locating the grave of the great-great-great-grandmother of a sitting First Lady of the United States required technology that sees through soil, because the country had simply lost track of where she was buried. Now follow her son. Dolphus Shields, born into that household in 1859, went on to do something remarkable for a black man of his generation. He learned to read and write. He trained as a carpenter and eventually moved to Birmingham, Alabama, right as the city was becoming a major industrial center. He married a woman named Alice Easley, opened his own business, and became a respected figure in his community, including serving as a deacon in his church. Photographs of him from that era show a well-dressed, composed man surrounded by his family, the kind of image that, in that period, was itself a quiet act of defiance. One detail from the research stands out. Dolphus reportedly had a white half-brother, a son of Charles Shields, who would visit him in Birmingham and sit with him on his porch. When Dolphus eventually died in 1950, one day before the anniversary of his mother's death 12 years earlier, that same white half-brother was said to be the only white person present at the funeral. Neither of them, as far as anyone knows, ever publicly used the word brother to describe their relationship. They apparently just sat together, and one showed up when the other passed away. Nobody recorded what they talked about. There's a second branch of this family tree worth knowing, because it carries just as much weight. Michelle Obama's maiden name, Robinson, traces back through her father's line to a man named Jim Robinson, born into slavery around 1850 on Friendfield Plantation in Georgetown County, South Carolina. Friendfield wasn't a small operation like the Shields farm. It was a large rice plantation, worked by roughly 230 enslaved people producing enormous quantities of rice every year. Rice cultivation in that region was some of the deadliest forced labor in North America. Standing water, disease, brutal heat, and grueling hours. Many of the enslaved workers brought there were specifically trafficked because they came from West African regions with existing rice farming expertise. Their skill was, horrifyingly, the very reason they were targeted. After the Civil War, Jim Robinson stayed on and worked the same land as a sharecropper because freedom in 1865 came with no land, no money, and few real options for most formerly enslaved people. He and his wife were also unable to read or write, according to surviving records, and he too was buried in a grave that went unmarked. Generations later, his descendants joined the Great Migration North, eventually settling in Chicago, which is how Michelle Robinson came to be born on Chicago's South Side rather than on a rice plantation in coastal South Carolina. Researchers found something else that ties both sides of this story together. All four of Michelle Obama's grandparents had multiracial ancestry, not just the well-known Melvinia line, but every branch of the family tree. Irish immigrants, free black Americans who held their freedom even before the Civil War, possible connections to other communities as well. The story America often tells about its racial history assumes two separate populations living in parallel, rarely touching. The genetic and historical record here says otherwise. The lines were tangled together the entire time, often through coercion, occasionally perhaps through something gentler, but almost always in silence, and almost never written down honestly at the time it happened. In June of 2012, descendants of both branches of the Shields family, black and white, met in person in Rex, Georgia, the same small town where this all began. Hundreds of people showed up. There was music, shared meals, exchanged phone numbers, and a lot of conversation between relatives who, until a reporter called them, had no idea the other side existed. A memorial marker was later placed at Melvinia's grave, listing her children by name. So, what does all of this actually add up to? Genealogists who work in this field are fairly direct about it. This story isn't unusual, it's common. Historians estimate that a very large share of African American families carry a similar buried history somewhere in their lineage, a hidden white ancestor, a silence someone kept for their own reasons, a document sitting forgotten in a county courthouse. The only reason this particular family's history became public knowledge is that a descendant happened to become the First Lady of the United States, which meant professional researchers and DNA testing were brought in to do work that, for most families, never happens at all. It's worth pausing on the Great Migration piece of this story because it's easy to treat it as a footnote when it's really one of the central hinges the whole family history turns on. Between roughly 1910 and 1970, around 6 million black Americans left the rural South for cities in the North, Midwest, and West. They weren't leaving because the South had simply run out of jobs. Many were leaving a system that had rebuilt, in new legal form, much of the control that slavery once provided, sharecropping arrangements that kept families perpetually in debt, segregation laws that limited where people could live, work, or even walk, and the constant threat of racial violence that operated with almost no consequence for the people carrying it out. When Michelle Obama's paternal relatives made that same trip north, ending up eventually in Chicago, it wasn't a minor detail of geography. It was the decision that put her in a Southside hospital in 1964, rather than somewhere in the rural low country of South Carolina. One family's choice to get on a train reshaped everything that came after it, including a marriage, 2 daughters, and eventually a presidential campaign that sent researchers digging back into exactly the history that MOVE had been an attempt to leave behind. It also helps to understand why this particular investigation took as long as it did, and why it needed DNA at all instead of just more determined archival digging. Skilled genealogists can sometimes work around the 1870 wall using plantation records, wills, tax rolls, and Freedmen's Bureau documents, piecing together fragments where they exist. But those records are inconsistent from state to state, and in plenty of cases, especially for smaller farms like the Shields property with only a handful of enslaved people, the paperwork is thin or simply doesn't survive. DNA doesn't rely on someone having bothered to write anything down at all. It sits in the body, gets copied into every new generation, and waits. That's part of why this case became such a notable example in genealogy circles specifically. It demonstrated publicly and unambiguously that genetic testing could recover answers that paper records had permanently lost. There are questions here that will never be answered. We will never know for certain what happened between Melvinia and Charles Shields in 1859, because Melvinia decided that information would die with her, and she was entitled to the choice, arguably one of the very few choices life ever allowed her to make freely. Researchers trying to trace Jim Robinson's origins hit a similar wall going back toward Africa. No ship name, no port of departure, no record of the specific person who was taken. That part of the story is permanently gone, and no DNA test currently available can recover it. What DNA testing did manage to do was remarkable in its own right. It took a silence that had survived 150 years, survived the Civil War, survived Reconstruction, survived every census taker and every family member who ever asked and never got an answer, and it broke that silence using nothing but a cheek swab and a molecule nobody involved in the original story had ever heard of. It did what no will, no deed, and no confession ever could. It told the truth about what happened on a small farm in Clayton County, Georgia in 1859, whether anyone alive wanted that truth told or not. And that raises a bigger question than just one family's history. Millions of ordinary people are mailing their own DNA to labs right now for entirely unrelated reasons, out of simple curiosity. Every family carries at least one document nobody ever filed, one name nobody ever wrote down, one conversation nobody ever recorded. For generations, those silences held because the people who kept them were counting on the record staying broken. It doesn't stay broken anymore. The real question isn't really about what the science revealed regarding Michelle Obama's family. It's about what it's quietly starting to reveal about everyone else's.